That little repair shop won't survive another year. The words echoed across the crowded trade expo floor, sharp enough to turn heads and quiet enough to sting. Nobody laughed louder than Victoria Hayes, the CEO whose company dominated half the industrial market across 3 states. What she didn't know was that 6 months later, she would stand in complete silence, watching the man she mocked take everything she thought she owned. The convention center outside Columbus, Ohio buzzed with energy as hundreds of manufacturers, suppliers, and investors moved between displays under bright white lights. Polished machines gleamed beneath giant banners. Salespeople exchanged handshakes. Executives discussed forecasts worth millions of dollars. Hidden among the giants was a modest booth no larger than a 2-car garage. A simple banner read Carter Industrial Repair. No flashy screens. No expensive displays. Just a few refurbished components arranged carefully on a clean wooden table. Ethan Carter stood behind it wearing a faded blue work shirt with his company logo stitched above the pocket. At 41, he looked more like a mechanic than a businessman. His hands carried years of honest work. Small scars and worn calluses told stories no boardroom ever could. Across the hall, Hayes Industrial Group occupied nearly a quarter of the exhibition floor. Massive digital displays stretched toward the ceiling. Corporate representatives in tailored suits welcomed visitors with polished smiles. At the center stood Victoria Hayes herself. Confident, elegant, untouchable. She noticed Ethan's booth while walking with several investors. One of them glanced toward the small display and asked, "Who's that?" Victoria followed his gaze and smirked. "Just another small-town repair guy trying to play in a market he doesn't understand." A few people chuckled politely. The investor looked again. "Looks like he has some interesting restoration work." Victoria laughed softly. "Interesting doesn't pay the bills. Companies like that disappear every year." Ethan heard every word. He was only 20 feet away. The noise of the convention couldn't hide her voice. For a brief moment, the conversations around him faded. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The scent of machine oil mixed with fresh coffee drifting through the hall. His eyes moved toward Victoria, then toward the investors surrounding her, then back to the worn component resting in his hands. He said nothing. That was his way. For years, Ethan had learned that dignity rarely needed an audience. Victoria continued her tour without another glance. To her, the encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. To Ethan, it became something else entirely. Later that afternoon, as crowds thinned, Ethan packed his equipment into the back of an aging pickup truck with nearly 200,000 miles on the odometer. His phone buzzed. A photo appeared on the screen. His 10-year-old daughter Lily stood in front of her school science project, smiling proudly beside a handmade model wind turbine. Ethan's expression softened immediately. "How'd it go?" he texted. Seconds later, her reply arrived. "I got first place, Dad." A smile crossed his face, the kind that only appeared when nobody was watching. He climbed into the truck and started the engine. Across the city skyline, the setting sun painted the clouds gold. Most people leaving the expo believed they had seen the future of the industry standing beneath Hayes Industrial's giant banners. They were wrong. The future was driving home alone in an old pickup, carrying a toolbox in the back seat and a promise in his heart. And before winter arrived, that promise would lead him to an abandoned factory nobody wanted, a decision everyone called foolish, and a path that would quietly reshape an entire market. Ethan Carter woke every morning at 5:15 before the sun touched the rooftops of Millfield, Ohio. The house was small, the paint on the porch had begun to fade, and the old furnace rattled every winter, but it was home. More importantly, it was the only home Lily had left after losing her mother 6 years earlier. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen as Ethan packed a lunch into a worn blue cooler. Peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, a handwritten note folded neatly beside them. Across the hall, Lily emerged carrying a stack of school books almost too large for her arms. "Dad, do you think my turbine project can really help people someday?" she asked. Ethan smiled while pouring orange juice into a glass. "If it solves a problem, it helps people. That is how good ideas work." "Even small ideas?" she asked. "Especially small ideas," Ethan replied. Lily grinned and returned to the table. Moments like that mattered more to him than any contract or paycheck. Outside, the October air carried the sharp scent of fallen leaves. The sky glowed pale gray as Ethan drove Lily to school in his aging pickup. The heater clicked loudly before finally pushing warm air through the vents. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Lily gathered her backpack. "You are coming to the science fair next month, right?" she asked. Ethan looked at her and nodded without hesitation. "I would not miss it for anything." She smiled, closed the truck door, and disappeared into the crowd of students. Ethan waited until she reached the entrance before driving away. That had become a habit years ago, one he never broke. Carter Industrial Repair sat on the edge of town between a feed supply store and an abandoned lumber yard. The building looked unimpressive from the outside. Weathered brick, faded signage, 2 service bays. Most people drove past without noticing it. But inside, everything was organized with precision. Tools hung perfectly aligned. Workbenches remained spotless. Machines waiting for repair stood in neat rows. Ethan believed respect started with the details nobody saw. Around mid-morning, his longtime employee, Mike Dawson, entered carrying a clipboard. "You hear about Hayes Industrial?" Mike asked. Ethan continued tightening a component without looking up. "What about them?" "They are shutting down the old North River plant." Ethan paused. North River was one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the region 20 years ago. Entire neighborhoods had once depended on it. "Closing permanently?" Ethan asked. Mike nodded. "Auction next month. Nobody wants it. Too old. Too expensive." The shop fell quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across town. Ethan wiped grease from his hands and stared through the open service bay toward the highway. Most people saw a dead factory, rusted equipment, empty buildings, decades of decline. But Ethan had spent years studying systems others ignored. Production flow, equipment design, manufacturing efficiency. The gears in his mind began turning. Mike laughed lightly. Who would be crazy enough to buy that place? Ethan said nothing. Sunlight stretched across the concrete floor as dust floated through the air. The silence lingered for several seconds. Then he quietly asked, "When is the auction?" Mike lowered the clipboard. His smile disappeared. For the first time all day, he realized Ethan was serious. And somewhere beyond the edge of town, behind locked gates and broken windows, an abandoned factory was waiting for someone who could still see what it might become. 3 days later, Ethan parked outside the North River plant just after sunrise. A chain-link fence surrounded nearly 20 acres of abandoned industrial property. The main building stretched across the horizon like a sleeping giant forgotten by time. Broken signs hung crooked above empty loading docks. Tall weeds pushed through cracked pavement. Most people saw decay. Ethan saw possibility. He stepped through the open gate carrying a flashlight and a notebook. The cold morning air smelled of rust, wet concrete, and old machinery. Somewhere inside, water dripped steadily from a leaking pipe. The sound echoed through the enormous structure. As he walked deeper into the facility, memories surfaced. Years earlier, before life changed course, Ethan had spent countless hours designing production systems for manufacturing companies across the Midwest. He knew how factories breathed. He understood how materials moved, how wasted motion stole profits, and how small improvements created extraordinary results. Most executives only looked at financial reports. Ethan looked at systems. He stopped beside an assembly line covered in dust. The conveyor was outdated, but the framework remained solid. Nearby, a row of industrial presses sat untouched beneath years of neglect. Ethan ran his fingers across the metal and smiled faintly. "You are not finished yet," he whispered. The words disappeared into the empty building. For nearly 4 hours, he explored every corner of the property. The electrical systems needed upgrades. The storage areas required reconstruction. The offices looked frozen in another decade. Yet beneath the surface, he found something nobody else seemed to notice. The foundation was strong. The layout was efficient. The bones of the factory were still valuable. By the time he returned to his truck, his notebook was filled with sketches, calculations, and ideas. That evening, after dinner, Lily sat at the kitchen table working on homework while Ethan reviewed pages of notes spread across the surface. The old clock above the stove ticked softly. Rain tapped against the windows. Lily looked up from her math assignment. "Dad, what is that place you keep drawing?" Ethan glanced at the papers. "An old factory. Do you want to fix it?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Maybe." Lily tilted her head. "Everyone says old things are harder to fix." "Sometimes," Ethan replied. But sometimes old things still have good parts inside. Lily considered that answer for a moment. Then she nodded as if it made perfect sense. The following week, word spread throughout Millfield that the North River plant would officially be auctioned. Local business owners gathered at diners and coffee shops discussing the property. Most shared the same opinion. The factory was finished. Too expensive. Too risky. Too far gone. One morning at Benson's diner, Mike slid into a booth across from Ethan carrying a newspaper. "The auction is getting attention," he said. "Developers are looking at the land." Ethan sipped his coffee. "The land is not the valuable part." Mike laughed. "That building is a money pit." Ethan remained calm. "Only if you do not know what you are looking at." The waitress paused while refilling coffee cups. Two farmers nearby stopped talking long enough to listen. Mike leaned forward. "You are seriously thinking about this, are you not?" Outside, gray clouds drifted across the Ohio sky. Inside, the scent of fresh pancakes filled the air. Ethan folded the newspaper and looked toward the window. His expression never changed. But the decision had already begun forming in his heart. While everyone else saw the end of a story, he was beginning to see the first chapter of a new one. And for the first time in years, the future felt larger than the walls of his small repair shop. The auction was scheduled for the second Thursday of November, and with every passing day the numbers became harder to ignore. Ethan sat alone in the small office behind his repair shop long after sunset, surrounded by spreadsheets, property reports, and handwritten calculations. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across stacks of paper, while darkness filled the rest of the room. Outside, a cold wind rattled the metal siding. Inside, one question refused to leave his mind. Was he willing to risk everything for a future nobody else could see? The answer should have been simple. It was not. The North River plant would require nearly every dollar he had saved. Even then, it would not be enough. Equipment upgrades, permits, repairs, insurance, payroll. The costs stretched far beyond the purchase price. Any mistake could destroy everything he had spent years building. The next morning, Ethan sat across from a loan officer at Millfield Community Bank. The office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. A framed photograph of the town square hung behind the desk. The loan officer adjusted his glasses and reviewed the documents for a second time. "You are requesting financing for an abandoned manufacturing facility?" he asked. "Yes." "The one near the river?" "Yes." The man stared at the numbers again. "Mr. Carter, your repair business is stable, profitable, respectable. Why would you risk that?" Ethan folded his hands calmly. "Because stability and growth are not always the same thing." The loan officer leaned back in his chair. "Most people would call this dangerous." Ethan nodded. "Most people are looking at what the factory is. I am looking at what it could become." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Questions, projections, concerns, doubts. When Ethan finally left the bank, approval was far from guaranteed. Yet something inside him remained steady. That evening, word spread through town faster than he expected. By Friday morning, nearly everyone seemed to know about his interest in the factory. At Benson's diner, conversations quieted when he entered. At the hardware store, customers exchanged curious looks. Some admired his ambition. Most questioned his judgment. "He is betting too much," one man whispered. "That place has been dead for years," another replied. Ethan heard the comments. He never responded. Across the state, the news eventually reached Hayes' industrial headquarters. Victoria Hayes sat at the head of a polished conference table overlooking downtown Columbus. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline behind her. One of her executives slid a report across the table. "You might find this amusing," he said. Victoria scanned the page briefly before smiling. "The repair shop owner?" she asked. "The same one from the expo. Apparently, he wants North River." A few executives chuckled. Victoria closed the folder. "He cannot be serious. According to local reports, he is pursuing financing." The room filled with quiet laughter. Victoria shook her head. People mistake confidence for competence all the time. The meeting moved on within minutes. To her, the story was nothing more than a brief distraction. But hundreds of miles away, Ethan stood inside the empty factory one final time before the auction. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows. Long shadows stretched across silent production floors. He listened carefully to the stillness surrounding him. The building felt forgotten, overlooked, dismissed. In some ways, it reminded him of himself. He looked across the vast space and imagined machines running again, workers returning, lights glowing through the winter darkness. Then he made a decision. If the opportunity came, he would not hesitate. He would place the bid, even if it meant putting everything he owned on the line. The auction lasted less than 20 minutes. Years of history, thousands of memories, and nearly 20 acres of industrial property changed hands in the time it took most people to finish a cup of coffee. When the final number was announced, a murmur moved through the room. Ethan Carter had won. Not a corporation, not a developer, not an investment group. A small-town repair shop owner had just purchased one of the largest abandoned factories in the region. The reactions came immediately. Some called him brave. Most called him reckless. Ethan ignored both. 3 days later, he stood inside the factory with a set of keys in his hand and a responsibility heavier than anything he had carried before. The building was colder now. November winds slipped through aging seals around the windows. Dust covered nearly every surface. Long corridors stretched into darkness. Yet Ethan felt something he had not felt in years. Purpose. The first weeks were exhausting. Every morning began before sunrise. He opened the repair shop at 7, managed customer work throughout the day, then drove to the factory after closing. Many nights he remained there until nearly midnight. The sound of scraping, cleaning, measuring, and rebuilding slowly replaced years of silence. Mike Dawson joined him whenever he could. A retired electrician named Walter Briggs volunteered several evenings each week. A former maintenance supervisor from the original plant offered advice after hearing what Ethan was trying to accomplish. None of them were chasing money. They were building belief. One evening, Lily sat on a folding chair inside the factory office wrapped in a winter coat while finishing homework. The overhead lights hummed softly. Ethan reviewed equipment layouts spread across an old drafting table. "Do you ever get scared?" Lily asked. Ethan looked up. "Of what? What if everybody is right?" she asked quietly. The question lingered in the room. Outside, wind rattled loose branches against the building. Inside, the smell of fresh paint mixed with old concrete. Ethan walked over and sat beside her. "Everybody has been wrong before," he said. "Including me." Lily smiled slightly. "That is not very encouraging." Ethan laughed. "The point is not being right all the time. The point is believing something is worth trying." Lily considered that answer carefully before returning to her homework. Winter arrived early. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow gathered along loading docks and empty parking lots. Utility bills climbed. Repair costs appeared unexpectedly. Several nights Ethan sat alone reviewing financial statements that seemed determined to challenge every decision he had made. There were moments when doubt whispered louder than confidence. Moments when the numbers looked impossible. Moments when failure felt close enough to touch. Yet every morning he returned. Every evening he stayed. Slowly, almost invisibly, progress began to appear. New wiring illuminated entire sections of the building. Refurbished equipment came back to life. Storage areas became operational. Production lines started taking shape. It was not dramatic. It was not glamorous. It was simply steady work performed by people who refused to quit. Across Ohio, most industry leaders remained unaware of what was happening inside the old North River plant. They saw an abandoned factory. Ethan saw a future company. And while others spent their time discussing why success could not happen there, he spent his building the reason it would. By early spring, the North River plant no longer looked abandoned. It still carried scars from years of neglect, but now the parking lot held trucks instead of weeds. Lights glowed behind windows that had been dark for nearly a decade. The steady hum of machinery returned to buildings that many people believed would never work again. Progress remained fragile, but it was real. Every dollar still mattered. Every decision carried weight. Yet for the first time, Ethan could see momentum beginning to replace uncertainty. One Tuesday morning, he received a call that seemed ordinary at first. The number belonged to Midstate Agricultural Equipment, a regional supplier that had worked with Hayes Industrial for years. Ethan nearly let the call go to voicemail while reviewing production schedules. Instead, he answered, "Ethan Carter speaking." A brief pause followed. Then a voice said, "We have heard about what you are building out there. We would like to visit." 2 days later, 3 executives walked through the factory. Ethan guided them across production floors, explained his redesigned workflow, and demonstrated equipment modifications that reduced waste while increasing output. He spoke, calmly. He never exaggerated. He never promised miracles. He simply explained what the system could do. The visitors asked questions for nearly 3 hours. At the end of the tour, one executive stopped beside a newly restored assembly line. "How long did it take you to develop this process?" he asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "About 15 years. The executive looked confused. Ethan smiled slightly. "The factory took months. The experience took 15 years. The answer stayed with them. A week later, while Ethan was helping load inventory onto a truck, an email arrived. Midstate Agricultural Equipment wanted to move a major contract to North River. Ethan read the message twice to make certain he understood it correctly. The contract was larger than any deal he had ever secured. Large enough to fill production schedules for months. Large enough to create new jobs. Large enough to change everything. That evening, he gathered his small team inside the factory break room. Coffee cups rested on folding tables. Work gloves lay beside notebooks. Everyone looked exhausted. Everyone looked hopeful. Ethan placed the contract on the table. "We got it," he said. For a second, nobody moved. Then smiles appeared. Walter laughed first. Mike shook his head in disbelief. A quiet celebration filled the room. Nothing extravagant. Just relief. Just gratitude. Just the feeling that months of sacrifice had finally produced something tangible. Nearly 100 miles away, the same news reached Hayes' industrial headquarters the following morning. Victoria Hayes reviewed a market report during a leadership meeting. Her expression remained neutral until she reached a single line buried halfway through the document. She stopped reading. "Repeat that," she said. An executive cleared his throat. Midstate Agricultural Equipment transferred production to North River Manufacturing. The room fell silent. Victoria looked up slowly. "North River?" "Yes." "Ethan Carter's company?" "Yes." No one laughed this time. Outside her office windows, downtown Columbus moved through another busy morning. Inside, Victoria stared at the report for several seconds. One contract did not threaten an empire. One customer did not change a market. Yet something about the numbers bothered her. She remembered the small booth at the trade expo, the repair shop owner, the quiet man who never argued, the man she dismissed in less than a minute. For the first time, she requested a complete file on Ethan Carter. And while she began searching for answers, another truck rolled through the gates at North River, carrying the first shipment for a contract that almost nobody believed Ethan could win. The first contract changed perceptions. The next 3 changed the conversation. By midsummer, trucks arrived at North River from dawn until well after sunset. New employees filled positions that had sat empty for years. Local restaurants stayed busy serving crews working extended shifts. Hardware stores reported their strongest sales in nearly a decade. What began as a gamble was quietly becoming an economic revival. Yet success brought new challenges. Demand increased faster than production capacity. Customers wanted shorter delivery times. Suppliers wanted guarantees. Competitors wanted answers. Every day seemed to present a new problem waiting to be solved. Ethan welcomed them all. One Monday morning, he stood beside a production line reviewing output reports when Mike approached carrying a stack of papers. 3 more inquiries came in overnight, Mike said. 2 from Indiana and 1 from Kentucky. Ethan accepted the reports and reviewed them carefully. "Can we handle the volume?" Mike exhaled slowly. "Not if everything arrives at once." Ethan nodded. "Then we improve the process again." That answer had become familiar. While competitors focused on defending market share, Ethan focused on solving problems. He studied workflow patterns late into the evening. He redesigned equipment layouts. He reduced wasted movement. Small improvements accumulated week after week. Customers noticed. Orders increased. Reputation spread. Across the region, executives began asking the same question. Who exactly was Ethan Carter? At Hayes Industrial Headquarters, the atmosphere had changed noticeably. Monthly reports showed a pattern that no one could ignore. Several long-term clients had reduced orders. Others were requesting meetings. Market analysts highlighted a growing trend. North River Manufacturing was gaining momentum. Victoria Hayes sat in silence as charts appeared on a conference room screen. "This cannot continue," one executive said. Another nodded. "They are offering better turnaround times." "And better customization," someone added. Victoria studied the numbers carefully. She had spent years building one of the most respected industrial companies in the Midwest. She understood competition. She respected excellence. What troubled her was not the growth itself. It was the source. The small operation she once dismissed had become a legitimate threat. Later that week, she visited one of her largest clients personally. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Near the end, she finally asked the question she had avoided. Why are you moving part of your production to North River? The client leaned back thoughtfully. Because they listen. Victoria remained composed. We listen. Not the same way, the client replied. When there is a problem, Ethan shows up himself. He studies it. He fixes it. Then he improves something we did not even ask about. The answer followed her home. Meanwhile, life at North River remained surprisingly simple. One evening, Ethan and Lily sat on the factory roof watching the sun disappear behind distant fields. The air felt warm. Crickets filled the silence between conversations. Lily looked toward the parking lot below, where dozens of employee vehicles remained parked after another busy day. You built all this? She asked. Ethan smiled. No. He pointed toward the factory. All those people built it. Lily followed his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. The fading sunlight painted the windows gold. The distant sound of machinery drifted through the evening air. Then a new shipment order arrived on Ethan's phone. It was the largest request North River had ever received. And with it came a realization spreading throughout the industry. This was no longer a comeback story. It was the beginning of a market shift that very few people saw coming. Victoria Hayes expected to find luck. She expected timing, favorable conditions, or perhaps an overlooked opportunity. What she did not expect to find was a trail of brilliance hidden beneath years of silence. The investigation began with a simple request. She asked her research team to compile everything they could find about Ethan Carter. Education, employment history, patents, consulting work, anything. 2 days later, a thick folder landed on her desk. Victoria opened it during a quiet evening after most employees had gone home. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls of her office, while the soft hum of air conditioning filled the room. Page after page revealed a story she had never imagined. Ethan had graduated near the top of his engineering program. He had spent years designing manufacturing systems used throughout the Midwest. Several efficiency models that transformed production costs across multiple industries carried his name. More surprising still, many of the operational improvements that helped modernize facilities acquired by Hayes Industrial years earlier originated from technical recommendations Ethan developed long before Victoria had become Chief Executive Officer. She turned another page, then another. The deeper she looked, the more uncomfortable she became. This cannot be right, she whispered. Yet the documents were undeniable. Technical journals referenced his work. Industry publications quoted his research. Archived conference records showed presentations delivered by Ethan years before he disappeared from public view. Then came the final section. Personal history. Victoria learned about the loss of his wife. The years he stepped away from major corporate opportunities. The decision to raise Lily while operating a small repair business. She sat back slowly. For the first time, the image she carried of Ethan began to collapse. He was not a repair shop owner who stumbled into success. He was an engineer, strategist, and builder who had quietly chosen a different path. The next morning, Victoria drove to Millfield without scheduling a meeting. She wanted to see North River with her own eyes. When she arrived, the factory was alive with activity. Forklifts moved inventory. Employees coordinated. Shipments. Production lines operated with remarkable efficiency. Nothing felt chaotic. Nothing felt wasteful. Every system seemed deliberate. She remained unnoticed for several minutes while observing from a distance. Then she spotted Ethan near one of the loading bays speaking with employees. He listened more than he talked. He answered questions, reviewed schedules, solved problems. There was no performance, no display of authority, just steady leadership. Nearby, Lily sat at a picnic table finishing homework while waiting for her father. Several employees stopped to greet her by name. Victoria watched quietly. The scene felt strangely different from the executive world she knew. Here, success seemed personal, human, earned. As she prepared to leave, her eyes settled on a framed photograph hanging inside the main office. It showed Ethan standing beside a group of engineers nearly 20 years earlier. Several names beneath the image were instantly recognizable. Industry leaders, innovators, executives, men and women whose ideas shaped modern manufacturing. Ethan stood among them, not behind them, not beneath them, among them. Victoria stared at the photograph for a long moment. The realization settled heavily into her thoughts. The man she dismissed at the trade expo had never been small. She had simply failed to recognize his value. And as North River continued growing stronger with every passing week, that mistake was becoming more expensive than she ever imagined. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings and record production numbers. Industry publications that once ignored North River now featured it on their front pages. Analysts described it as one of the most remarkable manufacturing turnarounds in the Midwest. Customers continued shifting contracts. Suppliers expanded partnerships. New employees filled positions faster than human resources could process applications. What had started as a forgotten factory had become one of the fastest-growing operations in the region. The defining moment came during the Midwest Industrial Leadership Summit in Chicago. Executives, investors, manufacturers, and reporters gathered beneath the bright lights of a convention center larger than several football fields. For the first time, North River Manufacturing had been invited as a featured company. Ethan almost declined. Public recognition had never interested him, but Mike convinced him to attend. Sometimes people need to see what perseverance looks like, he said. Ethan finally agreed. On the morning of the summit, hundreds of attendees filled the main ballroom. Large screens displayed market data while industry leaders discussed trends and forecasts. Victoria Hayes sat near the front beside several executives from Hayes Industrial. Ethan sat quietly several rows away with no entourage and no publicity team. Lily occupied the seat beside him, proudly wearing a visitor badge around her neck. During the keynote presentation, a market analyst revealed the latest industry rankings. The room grew noticeably quieter as the numbers appeared on the giant screen. North River Manufacturing had achieved something almost nobody believed possible. In less than 2 years, it had become one of the leading suppliers in multiple product categories. Several of those gains came directly from markets long dominated by Hayes Industrial. Whispers moved across the ballroom. Reporters typed rapidly. Cameras focused on the stage. Then came the final announcement. North River had been selected as Manufacturing Transformation Company of the Year. For several seconds, Ethan simply sat still. Lily grabbed his arm and smiled so widely that he could not help smiling back. The audience rose into applause. Not because of the numbers, not because of the growth, because everyone in the room understood how unlikely the journey had been. Ethan walked to the stage beneath bright lights and accepted the award. He thanked his employees. He thanked the community. He thanked the people who believed in a future hidden beneath years of dust and doubt. Then he stepped away from the microphone. No grand speech. No celebration. Just gratitude. As the applause faded, something unexpected happened. Victoria Hayes stood and walked toward the stage. The ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of eyes followed her. She stopped beside Ethan and faced the audience. For a moment, she searched for the right words. Then she spoke. Several years ago, I made a mistake. The room remained perfectly still. I looked at a man and judged him by what I could see. I saw a small repair shop and assumed I understood his value. She glanced toward Ethan. I was wrong. No one moved. No one interrupted. What he built was not just a company. He reminded all of us that character matters. Vision matters. Respect matters. The silence that followed felt larger than any applause. Ethan nodded politely. There was no bitterness in his expression. No triumph. Only quiet dignity. Later that evening, after the summit ended, he and Lily stood outside overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Lily looked up at her father. Are we successful now? She asked. Ethan smiled gently. We were successful the moment we stopped being afraid to try. The wind moved softly between the buildings as father and daughter stood together. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by everything he had built, Ethan understood that the greatest victory had never been winning a market. It had been keeping his character while doing it. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.